Welcome to Realizing Resilience, a podcast from the Connecticut Women's Consortium. We're not behavioral health professionals, but we're your gateway to real conversations with the experts. Each episode, we'll delve into the vast landscape of mental health, from personal stories to expert insights. Together, we'll bridge the gap between clinical expertise and personal experiences, connecting with diverse voices and perspectives. Join us for insightful conversations that demystify the world of mental health.
Stefan, from Western North Carolina, earned his master's degree from Columbia University School of Social Work in New York. While in grad school, he worked as a school counselor in the Bronx, where he led restorative justice initiatives to combat the school-to-prison pipeline. With experience as a school social worker, psychotherapist, and clinician at a children's mental health clinic, Stefan founded TransForward Care in 2019 to expand access to gender-affirming, integrative, trauma-informed care for everyone. As an EMDR-IA-approved consultant, he specializes in EMDR therapy, somatic experiencing, hypnosis, regression therapy, and trauma-informed practices. He completed his past life regression training with Dr. Brian Weiss at the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies in New York, and is completing his hypnotherapy certification with the International Association of Counselors and Therapists. Alongside his clinical practice, Stefan collaborates with attorneys as a forensic mitigation specialist with a specialization on issues related to gender experiences, complex trauma, and their effects on emotional development and behavior. Stefan has presented on the embodiment of gender at Yale, nonprofits, schools, and legal organizations, emphasizing integration for personal and global healing. His work explores the interconnection of gender, sexuality, wellness, holistic health, and collective consciousness.
Welcome back to Realizing Resilience. I'm Alana.
And I'm Marisa.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Stefan Simanovich. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So first and foremost, what inspired you to start incorporating holistic healing approaches into your work with trauma, and how has that worked into your treatment philosophy?
Well, I realized quickly, I don't want to say quickly, it took me a long time I just feel like in my education, I went to Columbia in New York, from New York, or North Carolina, I moved up to New York to go there. And I feel like in my education, and of course this was 12, 13 years ago, but still, and I don't know what they're learning nowadays because I'm not in classes. But I feel like in my education, I didn't learn enough about trauma, even in the clinical realm. And I was actually going to be, I was school-based, so I thought I was going to work in education for a while as a school social worker. I wanted to advocate for more educational justice. But of course, life takes us in different paths, as we know. And I realized I didn't learn a lot when I started opening my clinical practice and doing clinical work with children, family, and people. So what dramatically shifted for me was I felt very stuck often in being able to support the people I would be working with, whether it be families, kids, or whoever. And that's why it led me to be trained in EMDR therapy and explore more practical interventions or what could support people in moving beyond their mental emotional distress. And through the years, I think that, and I try not to I hope people don't hear me saying anything's bad or wrong. It's not about that at all. But I think that like CBT therapies or talk therapy can really be limiting in supporting people in uncovering roots of their emotional mental distress. And for a long time I was doing, of course, talk therapy or CBT therapy, psychotherapy, and I was getting stuck, the client was getting stuck, and really supporting people find health and healing. And, our subconscious mind really holds a lot of our mind, our whole mind. Why we do the things we do, why we make the choices we make, the language we use. And so I was really interested and drawn to therapies that were going to support and unraveling the subconscious mind to support people, which EMDR therapy does that, hypnotherapy. And also, I should say too, I think, I'm a transgender man. That's important in the sense of, I work with, of course, all people now, all genders, but it was, even in my own personal experiences, I really had to step out of my physical body to really get to know the depths of who I am at my core, outside of really limiting beliefs about gender. And of course, we'll talk about sexuality too. I had to do that for myself, and EMDR therapy and therapies like hypnotherapy, those that are more integrative, supported myself too. And a lot of the things that I started to implement with clients transgender clients, of course, but really all people. I wanted to create frameworks and understandings that could support people in viewing themselves more holistically and connected to the whole, to the world, and not just us as an individual self and body. I think the United States is very important to talk about as we come, I think, from a very individualistic mentality when we talk about distress and health and healing versus a collective. And I think, of course, myself being trans, but really for all of us, our social identities and who we are so intertwined to our sense of self and our collective mentalities dramatically, and if not largely, shape, who we are and how we see ourselves. So, holistic therapy is such an amazing way to go. I think that's where we're going as a world in general. I think we're moving away from kind of these mind-body separating mentalities that I think was founded in a lot of, especially at least in the Western world. I think there's a big difference, of course, globally, but in the Western world, I think we're starting to step out of those a lot and shift more into holism and holistic mentalities, because we're just starting to scientifically learn and as a collective learn so much more of how our bodies keep the score, how our biology is totally intertwined with the energy within our inner selves. Share and share and share, by the way. I'm trying to limit myself because I know we only have a short.
I think that's great. I mean, I think it's important that anyone, whoever, if practicing what they're preaching also, and that they're passionate about what they do. And that I think it's important to be able to, your practitioner, to someone that you speak with, can go on about something forever, because it means that they like what they do and they're dedicated to it.
True. It's just such a it's such a wide, we could go into so many directions. So yes, no, 1,000%, I could talk about it all day, and I'm one of those people that can go off many tangents off of it because it's all interconnected. But you gotta hold my coattail as I talk. But yeah, no, it's such an important topic, which is why I'm glad y'all are, of course, on this podcast, uplifting, of course, holistic health. It's totally where we're headed. I think our healthcare is gonna shift more and more towards that. It might take several years, but we're going that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had also spoken about just kind of knowing with gender identity and sexuality and all of those things. And that made me think of the training that you're going to be doing with us on December 13th, Healing from Sexual Trauma with Considerations of Gender Identity. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this training focuses on the gender norms and how they impact survivors of sexual trauma and how integrative modalities can be implemented in treatment for sexual trauma.
Yes.
Can you kind of elaborate on why gender identity is an important consideration when treating clients with sexual trauma?
Yes. Well, it's a great question. Well, in a lot of my frameworks and when I talk about gender and the embodiment of gender, I really focus on gender as related to our inner self, or a core part of ourselves. I think gender diversity and trans experiences particularly really show the world that gender is far more than biological sex. It's connected to our body, of course. And this goes back to interconnection of mind, body, soul. But it's talking about gender as a core part of ourselves. And this is true for however you identify, cisgender people, trans people, that from birth, and I talk about this in my trainings, it immediately starts, or maybe even before birth, our gender identity starts developing, and it shapes our mental, emotional, spiritual, physical development because of how young boys and young girls are taught to express their emotions or to not express their emotions, how one is to even relate to their sexuality, to their self-expression. I mean, gender is such an amazing part of who we are and how we connect to the world. Though unfortunately, in a very dualistic society, particularly in the Western world, there's a hyper focus on gender being limited into biological sex, almost as if that was our fate, our destiny. So talking about gender in a more holistic way, we can also see how gender norms and roles are directly impacted into our sexuality and even sexual violence and sexual harm. So in the training, I'm going to be talking about, for example, when young boys are taught they can't be vulnerable, and then coupled with homophobia, transphobia, homosexism, all of the ways in which gender wounding can occur. When a young boy is taught from a young age, you can't be vulnerable or show your feelings, and then they're violated at a young age or sexually abused, that's going to really shape a young boy, and then who turns into a man's ability to share in those experiences. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about sexual abuse and sexual trauma. For example, you look at statistics on AI, because we can do this now. You're going to find a lot of statistics that show that young girls, women are victim to sexual violence and abuse far more than boys. But I think that's actually not true. And I think you're going to see it's 50-50, or a lot of young men and boys are victim to sexual abuse at a young age. This is not as talked about as much for all of these gender structures that we've put up within patriarchy and toxic masculinity that says that young boys can't express themselves, or that young boys just don't have emotions. So this is an example. Of course, we can go into a lot of different examples with these, but how gender collective values and mindsets and norms shape and contribute even to sexual violence and harm. I'm going to be talking about that on both sides. And even, with trans experiences, for example, there's a huge myth that, someone is trans because they were sexual abuse. I mean, I think that's very outdated, but still talked about, of course, in mainstream media, and maybe people's just ignorance. And I don't mean that in a bad way, just people don't know, I think it's just a social value or social mindset that's kind of been embodied within all of us, So, and that's not true. Oftentimes folks that are struggling to find themselves or their identity, particularly being transgender, oftentimes can be more vulnerable to sexual abuse and sexual trauma versus the other way around. So, to kind of sum it up, just talking about how, living in the United States, we live in a very hyper-masculine society, very hyper-masculine patriarchal society rooted in dominance control, and that is directly related to this epidemic that we have in society. It's really an epidemic, I believe, sexual violence and trauma that's not talked about as much in mental and healthcare. I think in general, I think it's more and more, but I've found in my practice that a lot of people, I just have stats here, my practice in Connecticut, about 60% of people had some form of sexual trauma, and 30% of those are sexual abuse. So, victim to sexual abuse perpetrated by an older, of course, adult or someone 5 years or older. My practice now in North Carolina, about 70% have experienced some form of sexual trauma, about 40% of those sexual abuse before the age of 10. And I say that because it's so much more prevalent, like as therapists and clinicians. And I learned this, of course, through my career, through my practice and career. Sometimes when you wouldn't even think someone's mental and emotional distress, say their symptoms or even a mental health disorder, when you float back or start to unravel the roots of that, those symptoms could be anxiety, depression, dissociate, whatever it is the symptoms are. I mean, sometimes I'd be surprised that it would always go back to that wounding in childhood or sexual traumatization, because sexual abuse and trauma, I hate to use most, and like make these extreme statements, but particularly under the age of reason, like 8, 7, if a young child experiences that, that is going to dramatically shape one's mental and emotional health through the course of the lifetime until that's mended or healed. And I've seen that countless times, and you would be surprised at the things that people present with. And then when you start to uncover that, how much of that is rooted in sexual trauma at a young age, or sexual repression too. Sexual repression is another thing I'm going to go into in the training. So sexual repression in the sense of a sexual identity or orientation, whether someone be queer or not, just sexual repressed, how that can also cause, what we see as complex PTSD much later in life. So it is my niche now and what I do, and of course I advertise or put myself out there as someone who specializes in sexual trauma, though it's still amazing to me, the folks, that come to me or the clients I work with. And oftentimes, sometimes, by the way, people have repressed these memories too, or don't recall that they were abused in childhood. It surprises me, but it's such I think, important to start to have these trainings and conversations among mental health therapists so that we can just be more aware of what to look for and how to support someone, because it's more common than we realize. And especially, I have to say this too, the epidemic of sexual violence in our society, I think, has to start be talked about and addressed more intentionally now, especially in the age of the internet. And of course, we know child pornography is and I know it's a heavy topic, and I want people listening to be aware this is a heavy topic, not to undermine it. But, it's super important because it's starting to impact young boys and girls more and more and more because of the internet and AI and the access kids have. And it's just something that I think culturally we're still learning to talk about in an intentional and healthy way, sexuality and gender, in a way that's more comprehensive and holistic for our really cultural development too, not just someone's individual development.
People, I think in general, obviously think of sexual trauma as a gendered issue, but not in that way, especially amazing point about the implications of AI. Like it's getting scarier faster than I think we can process. So it's like we need to have the basic conversation as it is, but it kind of needs to happen quicker and move in a different way before this becomes like impossible to handle because it's already hard enough for us to handle culturally.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's maybe this will push us to address issues more. Maybe it has to get to that for us to address these issues more and more because they're so prevalent, particularly for young boys. I can't express that enough. You know, boys and men to be able to come forward about their own experiences and to seek help, to seek mental emotional health. It doesn't mean that you're weak or that something's wrong with you, or that has any conditions to one's identity, or even sexual orientation. Because I'm going to talk about this in the training, a lot of reasons why people have a hard time processing and healing from these experiences because of these limiting beliefs we hold as a society. And that, sexual trauma is so important because it really zaps someone's identity, sense of power, sense of bodily autonomy, all these very essential things to maintaining, mental health and emotional health through our lifetime.
So you mentioned a little bit about how integrative therapies kind of help people feel more grounded in their bodies and in that way can be really effective with considerations of gender identity. But how do things like EMDR, somatic experiencing, hypnotherapy, etc., help address sexual trauma specifically?
Yeah, well, I think and I'll talk about this a lot at the training. I think it takes the part of the therapist or clinician to be very mindful and of course, strategic in how you're going to address these issues. Though with these therapies, as I mentioned earlier, they really get at the subconscious mind, which makes up about 80 to 95% of our mind is the subconscious. And talk therapies keep us in the conscious brain, the analytical brain, the conscious brain, the logical brain. Though these experiences, as we're learning, live in the somatic body, the emotional body, somatic body. And these therapies help. You're working with breath, first of all, breath, meditation, start to silence the logical analytical brain that holds so many limiting, you shouldn't talk about this, you can't feel this way, all of these things that it's almost like a critical factor, the critical factor brain that shields and protects us. And it's great. We need that brain, of course. It keeps us safe, though we have to start to just gently put that, on the side of your shoulder to start to open up. Okay, what are the network or the channels in the brain that still hold those woundings? Because we now, with parts work and working with dissociative personality structures, it's so important to start to tap into those emotional parts that are somatic, that are physiological. So it's not just abstract. This is what lives in our bodies. To start to be able to understand, okay, well, this is what's in my, in my behaviors, how I'm seen in the world. But this is really what's happening deep, deep down. And these experiences, I've worked with so many cases. I'm going to give plenty of case presentations at the training. That people, it's really important and we're understanding this more as it relates to trauma. Those experiences live as if, for example, I was 6 years old again. This is how this is going to manifest in my body, emotionally, mentally, the thoughts, the things I say to myself, the heartache in my chest, all of those emotional, how we emote. Emotions are about, it's the mind in action. That person really regresses to that age. Now, we might not be, of course, they're an adult, they're 30, whatever, 8 years old. But by using these therapies, we can start to go back to that wounded child part, that child that experienced that abuse, but hold space in a way that's going to be able to have that person process these experiences in a healthy way while we're maintaining grounded, in the body, in the office, while putting one foot, so to speak, back into that past experience so we can start to understand it from I like to say higher self point of view. I break that down like higher self. I mean, some people like that language, or core self, kind of that all-knowing self that realizes that what happened to that 6-year-old wasn't appropriate, because many people can hold that 6-year-old experience as, oh, it was my fault. Of course, we would never blame a 6-year-old for something like that, but people feel that way for a reason. And by talking about those, it doesn't always go away because we can dissociate from those emotional experiences just talking about them or analyzing them. Or I know, for example, as a 6-year-old, that wasn't my fault, but I feel that way. And that's like that internal conflict. So these therapies start to support one in really holding space, again, somatically. I mean, this is biologically, mentally, emotionally, start to heal those wounds and integrate in a way that feels more whole for a person, for their own balance and well-being. That's kind of, again, a blanket. I'm really trying to say. But in the training, I'm going to be going in depth and giving case examples of how this stuff works and breaking down parts and all this stuff. It'll be a juicy training, so I hope y'all can attend.
If that's not a plug, then I don't know what is. Quite honestly, that's a juicy training, would make anyone want to show up.
It is, it's important. I'm going to try my best. Like I said, I know it's like a heavy subject, and I always recommend people take breaks. Be mindful of yourself, because it's heavy, and we all have been through things, and I want people to take care of themselves. I think that's the most important as we start to I see it as really a movement. Beyond my training, a movement to be able to start to really address these things collectively, because I think it's just, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality, I always say that it's gender and sexuality and diversity, or even trauma, the wounding or the traumatic, harmful parts, but also the very beautiful parts of human sexuality and gender is a global, it doesn't have a race, doesn't have a culture, doesn't have a language. This is a global phenomenon. So I think it's just we're in this like very insignificant time where we're being offered the opportunity to start to address it.
And do you think now, with this kind of new movement of just putting more effort into solving these things and really addressing this stuff, do you think there's any emerging trends or practices in trauma care that you think will enhance the integration of gender identity and or holistic healing into treatment, kind of as a whole?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it's happening more behind the scenes and maybe out in front of our face, like what we see. But I think, going back to gender diversity, trans experiences, I think is totally pushing us to see gender much more holistically for all of us and not be confined in some of these limiting understandings of gender and what's possible for ourselves. But I think I think EMDR therapy is going to continue definitely to grow. It already has. Even the last 5 years, really the century, I think it's grown significantly. But I also think, hypnotherapy is something, it's interesting because like the founding fathers, so to speak, of psychology used it, and then they dropped it. And somehow along the way, we dropped hypnosis and hypnotherapy in our healthcare institutions, like insurance, for example. There's some insurances that won't cover it, which I find just boggling. And there seems to be this, like hypnotherapy has been now included in more holistic therapies like Reiki or spiritual therapies. It's kind of been conflated for some reason or another into a spiritual practice, but it's not. It's totally, I hope to see hypnotherapy come back into the mainstream mental health systems. Insurance is covering them and therapists being trained more in them. So they're so powerful to get to those subconscious roots. And it's so holistic too, in terms of working with the body, working with the mind, working with the emotional parts of someone in a very deep and relaxed state where you're really supporting someone get into that. You're not asleep, but you're not fully awake. You're in that kind of trance state where you can totally access this stuff in a very safe way with a trained therapist. So I hope and pray to see hypnotherapy come back in a more mainstream way, just like CBT. I hope in the future hypnotherapy is the new CBT. Or, of course, there's various versions of the somatic therapies that are coming out more and more. And yeah, I think it's going to continue to trend big time, because I think as therapists, at least myself and others and colleagues I know, we're CBT or talk therapy can be so limiting, especially when it comes to trauma. Trauma, no doubt. So I think there's going to continue to be a huge growth into that direction, a big swing.
Not to make this about me, but I did hypnotherapy a couple of years ago, and it was sick.
Right? What was your experience? Or what were you surprised by?
I was surprised that I was actually able to do the thing that I went there to help me achieve. I had major fear of being in crowds.
Yeah.
And it got even worse through COVID, and just the feeling of being surrounded by everyone and being closed off, it really freaked me out. And I ended up getting really expensive concert tickets that I wanted to go to so bad, and it was in the pit.
Oh, God.
I don't know why I did that, and it freaked me out, and I was like, I want to be here, but the
Mm-mm-mm.
thought of going is mortifying me.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
the fact that I was able to attend that concert and others after that,
Did you? Wow. One session, right? How many sessions did you
I
go?
did 2 sessions.
2 sessions. Yeah.
And it was really great, and I really enjoyed it, and it's helped me. The things that we kind of went through, I still think of like that safe place that we had thought in my head so we can
Yeah.
address the things
Yeah.
that I had the issue with. And I still, if I ever feel kind of freaked out, I imagine that place again.
Oh, yeah. Isn't that
And
powerful though?
it was cool.
Especially after two, that's a good point you bring up. It's like these therapies, it doesn't take long. Like you
Yeah.
don't have to be in therapy forever. We can talk about stuff forever, literally forever. But these therapies help to address the root. Yeah, because you in that moment, I mean, really, what, 2 hours or whatever, 3 hours of
Yeah.
therapy, whatever you did,
Hmm.
supported you in tackling. I mean, really, your subconscious mind got. I'm
Yeah.
safe. I can keep myself safe, whatever it was for you. I just think it's awesome that you. I mean, it was so quick because you're so right. It can be so quick, and I think for whatever reason we've shifted into long-term therapies. I guess because talk therapy has been so limiting. I don't know. Again, I don't want to make assumptions, but at least for myself, I've found that people experience relief much quicker, and you don't have to be with somebody forever to work through your problem. I mean, it's almost like we can become attached, and I get this from a client perspective, by the way, and the therapist, but we can kind of get attached to our therapists, as more friends, and again, nothing wrong. I just think that if you're seeking deeper healing, yes, hypnotherapy, EMDR, somatic therapies, whatever it is, addressing your nervous system is gonna go bring you miles, as you just said, Marissa. I mean, you still can use those tools today, and it brings you back there. So that's great.
I think this stuff is really exciting too because it seems like we've said this before on this podcast. It seems sometimes like mental health treatment is kind of stalled in a way that like some physical treatments haven't. I feel like for a lot
Definitely.
of things, like I have chronic eczema and like treatment has changed so much in my lifetime. Like in the past 10 years, there's like treatments that didn't exist when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And it seems like for a lot of therapy, we've been looking at it in this talk-based lens for so long. So it's really exciting to see this stuff become more mainstream.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Definitely y'all doing this podcast too. I mean, talking to more therapy. I mean, yeah, it's like a subtle movement the way I see it, because I don't think it's super visible yet in the mainstream, but it has to start. I mean, more and more people, for example, when I have people come in here, they already know so much because everything's online, whatever, TikTok and this, like, you're not psychoeducating people as much anymore. Not necessarily, it's like people are coming, at least as, again, my experience, and I know it's what I put out there. Of course, I think we get back what we put out. But I think in general, I've noticed people more these last 5 years, like, hey, I've been in talk therapy for 10 years or 5 years or a few. It's like people are seeking that deeper healing, which is cool. I think it's cool that we're starting to see more and more people collectively from all walks of life starting to tap more into the deeper parts of themselves, and like they don't have to stay hostage and or stuck into these patterns or ways of being anymore, into one diagnosis. To your point, Alana, I think we've like become hyper pathologizing too in our society and our therapies, or that kind of by brain disease model mentality that we've adopted. I think as therapists or healthcare, I think that's gonna slowly dissipate over time as these therapies become more known. More known, and people sharing about their personal experiences with them about any, and it could be about any. I mean, fear of flying, doesn't have to be necessarily trauma, but just getting over fears or symptoms. I think it's really cool. We're living in a very special time, I think, personally.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm excited for your training. I'm going to try to make it.
Oh, good. Thank you. No, I'm excited about it too. And again, for people to take care of themselves, I'm going to emphasize that. But yeah, we're going to have fun, and I'm going to actually do some practices with people as well. We'll do some version of meditating a little bit in the beginning, and just so people can kind of carry. And I'll give practical tools, that therapists can use with their clients. No matter if you're trained in EMDR, hypnotherapy, or any of this, I think sometimes we're limited. We think we have to be like experts are trained fully, and of course you got to be trained in these therapies, no doubt. But I think there's things that we can start to integrate into our healthcare models and mental health models, just simply meditating or supporting someone get into the breath and the body. So I'll be sharing a lot of those practices as well that therapists can take back with them.
Yeah, absolutely. We really appreciate you talking with us today. This is going to be great. And that training on December 13th, it's going to be amazing.
It will be amazing. Come. Come as you are. We'll have fun. We'll make it as fun as we can.
Links will be in the description to learn more about Stefan and sign up for Healing from Sexual Trauma with Considerations of Gender Identity. Check out our links below to keep up with us at the Connecticut Women's Consortium. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.